Numerous reports indicate that manufacturing has emerged as the favorite target of ransomware groups and hackers. In response, a new report from Industrial Media discusses the evolution of industrial cybersecurity, its current state, and the tactics hackers are using, including phishing schemes, malware, and ransomware attacks. It also details solutions in arming manufacturers with the knowledge and resources needed to win more fights on this highly complex and ultra-competitive battlefield. Download the industrial sector's new battlefield by going to manufacturing.net/cyber. Hi, I'm Jeff Franke, Editorial Director of Manufacturing.net and Manufacturing Business Technology. Welcome to Security Breach. We're back to discuss an all too familiar topic, ransomware. Ironically enough, it seems the topics we describe in this fashion become so familiar because we can't figure out viable, long-term solutions. I think part of the challenge for industrial organizations dealing with ransomware is we have to divide our energy and resources between prevention, detection, and response. Throw in the fact that you've got ransomware as a service organizations that continue to grow in complexity, and even after being brought down by law enforcement, will take on tactics like changing their name, working with different partners, or adjusting and using more advanced tools to conduct their nefarious acts. Any one of these is a challenge, but managing all of them is daunting, and hackers know this. But so do the good guys, one of which is our guest for today's episode. We're excited to welcome Jeff Kroll, Principal and Leader of Baker Tilly's cybersecurity practice, to Security Breach. The firm recently unveiled their Guide to Ransomware Prevention, and he's here to share some of those insights. Jeff, thanks so much for joining us today, and welcome to Security Breach. Jumping right into it a little bit, Baker Tilly put out their Guide to Ransomware Prevention. So maybe we can talk a little bit about some of the things, how you're seeing industrial ransomware and all the challenges associated with it from your perspective.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting, right? Ransomware is everywhere. So every industry is getting hit with ransomware.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of different attack vectors, right? So in some industries, people are going almost all the time, they're looking for a ransom to be paid, right? So they're looking to get in, lock things up, cause disruption, and cause disruption on a scale that people are sort of forced into paying the ransom, right? In a lot of industries, actually, they're also going after personally identifiable information, things like that has some value out in the dark web, or some ability to hold it over somebody's head if they don't pay the ransom. So they get kind of that double whammy. You also get that even in the industrial sector, right, where maybe they steal some IP that they don't want getting out there. Somebody doesn't want their customer upstream, downstream to know that IP's been taken hostage. So we're really seeing that across the spectrum, right, that it's not just the initial let's lock things up, but then it's like, what other value can we extract from the attack? Specific in really the manufacturing and industrial sector, you really get into a lot of ransomware where if they can lock up things that are mission critical to running the operations, they can force somebody to pay, right? So if it's, hey, I have 300 people out on the floor who showed up for work today and nothing's working, so we can't make anything today, that's a big problem, right? So there's a real immediate P&L hit that organizations feel. Sadly, what we're finding is because these criminal organizations are so well funded now, right? They found ways to make money. They found ways to get the Bitcoin, whatever it is they're extracting out. They're also reinvesting, right? So they're getting more sophisticated. They're saying, they're almost like a normal business enterprise at this point. Hey, we made $500,000 locking up this kind of manufacturing facility. Who else is out there? Let's research it. Let's see who else uses that software stack we just saw. Let's find ways we can, do the intelligence to get out there and find that stuff. And the real scary thing is, in a lot of cases, everybody thinks ransomware happens and it's like, oh, well, they broke in yesterday and they launched their ransomware today. Usually that's not the case. They're in there for a while. They're searching, they're snooping. So maybe they already know who the other 10 top competitors are to a given organization. And so now they have 10 other organizations to go target. So it's really becoming difficult to protect against ransomware effectively, right? It's getting harder and harder, I should say. A lot of the normal things you do to protect are still the same, but it's just getting harder because they're getting smarter and smarter at how they're trying to extract that value for themselves.
Yeah. And I think one of the things with industrial cybersecurity, with the industrial sector, we get really frustrated at times because it's not just that we're getting hit, it's the quantity. It's the number of successful attacks that we continue to hear about. Even though we see different stats about the number of reported incidents or the number of reported incidents where the victim's paid is dropping or things like that, there's still just this onslaught of focus when it comes to the hackers hitting industrial and manufacturing facilities. What is your observations and why maybe manufacturing is a little bit slower to protect itself against ransomware compared to maybe healthcare or the financial markets?
Well, I think it's interesting, right? Because I think manufacturing runs into a problem that in a lot of cases, you can't really have a fully redundant system, right? So for all those manufacturing systems, all the OT, all that stuff, right? It's just not practical. You'd say like, well, every machine's going to have 2 versions of whatever that system is so that if one goes down, the other can just pick up. Because of that, you lose that redundancy. So an attack can become much more significant, right? They can extract that value for themselves. They can get you locked up and needing to pay the ransom or just being disrupted because there isn't a ready backup, right? It's not like you can say, it's not like email where you go, well, we have immutable backups on our email and we'll just recover it somewhere else and we'll get that back up and running. When you're talking about, especially manufacturing systems, things like that, there's just no practical way to have a quick recovery, to have that hot boom, you just move to the next thing. And without that hot boom, you move to the next thing. It becomes a bigger target for them because they know they are more likely to be successful. And they don't need everybody to pay the ransom. It's all a factor of how easy is it to get stuff locked up and then what percentage you're going to pay a ransom.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's not always as easy as just kicking out the cord and trying to reboot or start over anymore. That's for sure. I think one of the things that's interesting too here is when we talk about ransomware, there's been a lot more transparency. I think a lot more information is being shared now. What are some of the benefits, I guess, you're seeing from a little bit more transparency, a little bit more sharing of information? Unfortunately, that's a byproduct of more hacks and more attacks, but there are some things that we're learning out there, I'm guessing, right?
There are. I think organizations are getting, with a little more information sharing, people are getting quicker about how to head off some of the new ransomware vectors as they come up, right? So we're not seeing as much of that brand new vector for a while there, it felt like people were getting locked up with ransomware where you kind of scratched your head and you're like, well, it's been floating around for like 2 years. Like, why is this happening still, right? So I think some of that has helped with the information sharing. It's still only as good as what people share, though. I mean, my experience is a lot of organizations don't share the really ugly, dirty skeletons of how they got, breached and how somebody got in or what they weren't patching or why they weren't segmenting a network or things like that. They leave that out of the discussion. They're just like, oh, they found this vulnerability and this is how they attacked it. So,
yeah. Is there been anything you mentioned a couple times here how the hackers they're evolving, they're getting more complex, their organizations are becoming more adept and better at what they're doing essentially. In your research and in your investigations, has there been a group or a tactic that really caught your attention or maybe a level of sophistication that really surprised you even though you're very familiar with this stuff?
I am actually usually most surprised by how unsophisticated a lot of the attacks are. How they initially get in. Once they get in, it can be sophisticated. But how many organizations, they get in through email, right? Okay. And they use that to just start poking their fingers, figuring out what's there. They start the whole setting up a separate chain, a separate email account, fake email accounts, all that. It's not that sophisticated, right? Once somebody gets in email, and I would say that still feels like one of the top ways when you really peel it back. So many of these stories start with, yeah, they were in our email for 6 months. And once they were in the email, then, you can reset passwords, you can know when things are happening. I mean, we always joke, not in this sort of ransomware, but also wire fraud related. It's like, never accept wire change orders on a Friday afternoon before a holiday, because they're always bad, right? It's like if somebody says right before July 4th weekend, let's change those wire instructions, it's like, just don't do it. Wait till next week.
Exactly. Well, and it's crazy. We don't think about it, but even things like the URLs that we use for logging into different systems, software, all of that is obviously housed in our email. And then if we do a password reset or whatever the case is, you're right. That's just the easiest access point potentially for a hacker. So when you look at industrial organizations, you mentioned you thought email is still the biggest soft spot from a security perspective, because we hear a lot of, all these endpoints and everything else that's going on too.
I actually believe it is, because I think the endpoint, you have to get in an environment to exploit those endpoints.
Okay.
I'll admit I don't have hard data around it, but it feels like almost every breach, you hear email somewhere in the story. It's like it's always in the story. So even though people say like, wow, we didn't segment this stuff off, and we probably should have, and there were no patches. The vendor doesn't even support patching anymore, so we knew we had to run something old. You hear that part of the story, but somebody had to get in, right? And it's the getting in piece that often it's because they managed to breach their way into email. The question I always have is, and nobody likes when you ask this question, but were they unintentionally let in, or were they intentionally let in? Like, and it's hard to peel that stuff back, but I always say, a lot of organizations, for enough money, you pay somebody something, they're going to click that link that lets them in, type of thing.
Very interesting. When we look at email, yes, it's a technology. Yes, we're sharing a lot of information that way. And we even have data points that just come automatically or fed into our email at times, especially in the industrial sector. We're tracking all this stuff and looking at things remotely. Do you think the solution there, and I know this is a bit loaded, is it technology-based, or does it go back to just the human factor? Does it go back to the human element and just training our employees a little bit better?
I think it's a little in between.
Yeah.
I think in a lot of organizations fail the least privilege concept. So they give too many people standing access to too much stuff, right? So when they get breached, because everybody's going to get breached, you have to go in with the starting off point that given a long enough time frame, every organization is going to experience some kind of breach, right? So then the question is, once they're in, how much access do they have? Because they haven't probably breached every single account in an organization. And they will go after administrators in fairness, right? But a lot of times people default to, well, we have these 30 people who work on this, so all 30 people need access all the time to be able to go change something. It's hard to challenge yourself and say, maybe they don't. Maybe only 3 of them do. And the other 27, if we need to turn on their access, we can have a process to go turn on their access, turn off their access, or some type of break the glass account for when we need to get in those things. That's where I think, that's why I say it's not really people. It's also not really technology. It's sort of like how you use the technology. You're actually, spending that time to limit access just to the minimum somebody needs, because that can undo a lot of damage or prevent a lot of damage quickly, right?
Yeah, we've had a couple of folks on the show that have mentioned a similar type of tactic, using that time-based access protocol in terms of limiting the number of folks that can get in there, or just setting it up for a certain amount of time, whether it's a contractor, an employee, or whatever the case may be. Makes a lot of sense. So, Jeff, looking at the threat landscape, really, especially in ransomware, it seems like we get into an international scene very quickly. A lot of state-sponsored actors out there. What are you seeing right now in terms of the role that some of those state-sponsored or hacktivists, or whatever they want to call themselves, are playing now in the industrial scene? We've seen that kind of trickle down now away from more infrastructure to just traditional manufacturing.
My take is I think it's a little bit of a side gig for them, for the state-sponsored. But I also think, you look at some of the states, they take a very long-range view on the world, right?
Yeah.
So they may not be thinking, how am I going to cripple this industry tomorrow, or in 5 years, or in 10 years? They're potentially thinking ahead, going, hey, let's keep attacking. Let's keep figuring out where the vulnerabilities are, because if we go to war with this country, what if we could lock up all their industrial activity in a day? What if we could, knock them all out quick? So I think there's obviously the cat and mouse, but I do think there's an element of, that's why we see some of these broader testing, figuring out what works, what doesn't work, and why they want to do it. And again, I also think there's an element of stealing IP that may happen under our nose that people don't even realize.
Yeah, we know there's certain countries out there that are really good at that. In the past, they were much less subtle than going the digital route in terms of just basically picking something up and reverse engineering it and going from there. Maybe you can talk to us a little bit more about Baker Tilly and some of the things that you guys are doing on the cybersecurity front.
So at Baker Tilly, we really, I always say we play on the process and control side of cybersecurity. So we view cybersecurity as risks to be mitigated, right? So we do a lot around, third-party assurance, things like SOC 2, if you've heard of it, CMMC certification coming up if you're in the DoD supply chain. A lot of work through the internal audit channel. So a lot of our work is looking at the risks around cybersecurity, looking at processes and controls, and helping to give recommendations on how to improve the processes and controls, right? We also do some things like vulnerability scanning, things like that. But a lot of our focus is really on that, how an organization prepares itself to have a sustainable cybersecurity program, something that can continue and has the right, right ways that it's viewed as mitigating risk and managing risk in an organization. Because I would say, what if I walk up to a house and the door's unlocked, it may always be unlocked. It may just happen to be that door was, unlocked at that moment. The question is somebody supposed to be locking the door? Is there a camera on that door? Is there a motion sensor on that door? All that other stuff is what really matters. And that's how I always liken it to cyber. We are those people saying, hey, do you have the right doors, right? Or the right process around how you're making sure that door is staying locked when it's supposed to be.
Excellent. A lot of that process focused and making sure all those checks and balances are in place for some organizations stems from a lot of the regulatory efforts that are out there, whether it be at the federal level or the SEC, like I think we were talking about a little bit before. What are you seeing on the move on that? Do we need more regulatory, more government involvement? Is that necessary? Have we finally reached a place maybe where the industrial sector can self-regulate a little bit? What's your take there in terms of the impact now and maybe down the road?
I think regulations can sometimes be good. They can sometimes be misguided. Oftentimes they're based in an understanding of technology that might be 10, 15 years old, not necessarily where people are thinking today. I think we're going to continue to see regulation. I think we're going to see, especially around third-party risk management, which will hit the industrial sector a lot, right? Because you're going to see that whole supply chain and how secure is the supply chain up and down. I think we will continue to see regulation there. Every regulator, federal, state, you name it, every regulator is somewhere on their list is we need to figure out cyber, right? We got to figure out cyber. It's something we got to do. We got to do something around cyber. How well and they write those regulations is really the question, because I would argue we're still seeing mass increase. We have some level of regulation, and yet we still see mass increases in cyber attacks, right? And even there's sometimes an element of some regulations make it feel like we're punishing the organizations that are being attacked by criminals, right? Which is an interesting thing, right? Like it's one thing to say, well, we want a minimum set of, people, good cyber hygiene, stuff like that. But then if on the flip side, you go, well, we're going to punish somebody because they got broken into, it's like, well, wait, don't you have to take that step back and go, were they ignoring our guidance? Or was it, bad guys are getting better every day, right? So.
Yeah. Or just the fact that they don't have the internal resources available to them to shore up their defenses as well as we'd like. I know personally, and I've said this before, I would like a little bit more focus on providing resources, providing funding, whatever the case may be, to help some of these, especially small to medium-sized manufacturers, catch up on the cyber front. Because as we've been discussing, they're only getting more complex and better at what they do.
Right. Yeah. And a lot of times it is cultural too, right? We actually see a lot of times, organizations that use MSPs sometimes find themselves getting further up the maturity continuum just because they're working with organizations that do it a lot. But it is, sometimes people are like, no, nobody's attacking me. I'm just whatever. I'm manufacturing desks, who would want to lock up my floor, right? Type of thing. And not necessarily thinking through, the hackers are opportunistic. They'll take anything they can. It costs them very little to, try an attack they've tried before and see if it works or not.
Absolutely. That kind of leads to another question as well. Nothing against MSPs and going that route, but we're getting to a point now where manufacturers need to have that internal subject matter expert when it comes to OT cybersecurity as well. It's hard. Number one, because a lot of times we just don't know where to start. In your experiences, and I've asked a lot of folks this question, but what is the best place to start in your opinion? Do you develop internally? Do you recruit from the outside? What have you seen work the best?
So that's a great question. So let's talk about cyber broadly, right? Almost tons of organizations across all industries are looking to hire cyber talent. But what's fascinating is when you dig beneath the curtain and you say, well, what cyber talent are you looking to hire? It's almost always, oh, people with 5 years experience, 10 years experience, 15 years experience, right? So it's like, where are you going to get the people with 0 to 5 years experience to the point they have 5 years experience? I think that's a challenge across all industries, all of cybersecurity right now. You get into the industrial sector with OT, and you're all of a sudden talking about a niche area in a lot of cases very specific to the organization. It's knowledge you're going to have to learn into that organization. Maybe you can get it on the market. I actually think a more sustainable path may be for some organizations to say, hey, you know what? We're going to do interns every year. We're going to hire somebody out of college. We're going to train them up. We know they might leave us in 3 or 4 years, but if we're just always replenishing with another 1 or 2 out of college, depending on the size organization, right? I actually think that may be a cheaper long-term solution. If you have enough existing OT knowledge in-house, that may be a cheaper long-term solution than trying to hire from the outside always, because there's so much demand when you get 5 years plus of experience, and such a lacking demand less than 5 years of experience, right? And it's interesting because a lot of the colleges are now running cyber programs. The colleges have really caught up with some of them, some really great cyber programs. But I even know, because we recruit a lot, some of them struggle to find positions coming out of college, which again, you scratch your head and you go, but everybody needs cyber help. It's like, yeah, but other organizations, like, I'm not hiring the recent grad. I want somebody who's been doing it. So.
Well, and I think that meshes well with manufacturing, because we have this issue right now with all of this, they call them the machine whisperers, sort of retiring out of manufacturing. They know organically just how to solve a lot of these problems from a maintenance perspective and an operations perspective. That organic knowledge is leaving. So almost taking that approach now with bringing some of these new folks in to help them develop those types of skills so they know the system so well in and out, that could be a really powerful asset to have. I think it's an interesting approach.
It could also breathe life, right? Because in some cases, just because this system's always worked that way, somebody who's seen some different technology, some new stuff, might be like, hey, I remember I learned in college about this other thing. Maybe we should explore if that's, a better way to approach this.
Absolutely. Well, one of the things that fresh perspective can bring, especially when you touch on supply chain, I think supply chain is an area where I've seen the biggest influx of new tools and technologies and software platforms from a cybersecurity perspective to help on the defensive posture a little bit. But what this also leads to is just this proliferation of tools potentially on the OT side. And folks are going, do I need a lot of this stuff? Where do I need greater help? Where should I spend these resources? What advice could you give our listeners, our audience there, in terms of the tool selection process?
You're right. There's been a proliferation of tools. It's hard because in some cases you get to a niche product that you go, works great for my business. Then you have to go, but is that going to really be sustainable long term? But then you have to think, is that the product that's going to win the day, right? So, I know I bought 2 products so far. I won't name them because I'm mindful of security. And in both cases, home use technology, let's call it. In both cases, I bet right, because they were bought by a much, much larger organization. So now there's all sorts of funding behind the stuff I bought, right? And upgrade paths, things like that. Being able to know you're betting right is really hard, right? And it takes some luck at best. I think it's a matter of looking at what are peers doing? What are people doing in the industry? What's starting to separate as a leading practice? I tell people, all the time, one of the best things you can do is make sure you're involved in your industry trade groups. Like, know your peers, even if they're a competitor. Know who your peers are at your similar organizations, because there's gonna be stuff they're gonna be willing to share with you. And in most cases, things like supply chain is probably high on the list of things they'd be willing to share because they're feeling the same pain and want to pick your brain.
Yeah. The enemy of my enemy is my friend in these situations for sure. It's interesting too. There's all these different things going on right now. One of the questions I want to ask you about with ransomware, and it's a tough one, but when it comes to the response element of it, that's a place where manufacturers struggle, especially with ransomware. The biggest part of the response to a ransomware attack is, do you pay the ransom? What is your take there in terms of organizations that do or don't, or the best route to take?
So for the good of the world, I always say it's really easy for me to say nobody should ever pay the ransom. Bad guys would stop making money. Life would be great as long as nobody ever pays a ransom, right? Will stop this proliferation. I never advise people to pay a ransom. Not my place, one way or the other, I always say. I understand, though, when organizations get in a situation where they feel they have no choice but to pay the ransom. I mean, it is, if your option is I'm going out of business or I'm going to pay the ransom, it's, you get it, right? You get where people come from paying it. Not to say people should, but it's absolutely understandable in some circumstances that people wind up doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to circle back. I lost my train of thought a little bit before, and we were talking about some of those state-sponsored agencies and how they have the long game in mind. What we see in a lot of instances in the industrial scene is those dwelling attacks or live off the land type of attacks. Are you seeing a greater proliferation of those, or are there certain tactics that maybe can be employed that would help detect and identify those folks? So if you pay the ransom, if you don't pay the ransom, at least they're out of your system at some point, and really trying to minimize the impact there.
I think there are state-sponsored people in more organizations that are not doing anything than we realize. Yeah. That are just stealing information. They're literally just there for reconnaissance, and their intention is not to lock things up. I do think it's insane. I mean, it's one of the first questions people ask when somebody gets hit with ransomware. It's like, well, how do you know they're gone? They're like, oh, I paid the ransom and they gave me the keys, so I'm good now, right? And it's like, they're probably listening to this Teams call. Right?
Yeah, right, exactly.
So that's the type of stuff that it is hard, because again, I think the state-sponsored, they're not just in it for the money. They're in it for the money, but they're not just in it for the money. They're also in it for the disruption, for the stealing IP, any number of reasons to have a long haul to want to be in there. So
yeah, it's definitely part of the challenge, and I think part of the solution is just having these conversations and raising awareness of it, so that the next step is then developing the tools, figuring out the right tools to use, and move from that direction. Wrapping things up here a little bit, Jeff, really appreciate again the time. Appreciate you coming on. What are some of the big trends that you see? We've been talking a lot about things going on now. Let's look to the future a little bit. Maybe some things we should be aware of.
So I think AI is going to have an impact both on threat vectors and on defenses, right? So I think we're going to see that rapidly proliferate in both regards. And we're already seeing a little of that, right? So I think AI is going to have a big impact. Especially when you talk about, the social engineering and the story of the, deep fakes of a bunch of people on video telling somebody to go wire the money type of thing. That's going to get worse and worse, right? I think we're going to continue to see challenges with hackers just finding new ways to attack people. So I think it's going to get harder. I do think many organizations are getting a little smarter and better about going with how am I going to respond and recover, not just how am I going to prevent. So I mean, really thinking through something bad is going to happen. How am I going to respond and recover from it? It is critical. And you go back 5 years, people really weren't thinking about the respond recover piece of things. They were really stuck on how do I keep them out of my four walls? So I think we're going to continue to see in a good way, more focus in that respond recovery that hopefully minimizes the damage. So even if the attacks are there, they're not as damaging as they've been.
Well, my last question, you may have just answered it there, but we've talked about a lot of scary stuff, the dwelling attacks, the state-sponsored hacktivists, the ransomware increases, all of that. What's something that you can give us kind of before we say goodbye here that can help us feel good about things, help us get to sleep at night without worrying too much about all the bad guys out there?
I think it's that technology is evolving, right? And it is an issue that everybody's focused on. So, probably gone are the days where somebody could be blissfully ignorant that, they had massive vulnerabilities and weren't dealing with them. So I think because of that, right, cybersecurity is a risk management issue, I always say. And for years, cybersecurity was viewed as an IT issue. And I think that's changing in many organizations where now it's viewed as a business issue, which is good because we are seeing more airplay at, the C-suite level, more airplay at the, board level where, and we see it where, much tougher questions are getting asked around why aren't we doing more? Why aren't we doing this? Why do we do it that way? And sometimes those questions do trigger, more people weighing in ways that can be helpful. So I do think on the positive front, there is much more awareness in a general business sense of how important cyber is.
Thanks, Jeff. And for more information on the work he and his colleagues are up to, you can check them out at bakertilly.com. Also like to thank you for joining us today, and to catch up on past episodes, you can go to manufacturing.net, IEN.com, or mbtmag.com. You can also check Security Breach out wherever you get your podcasts, including Apple, Amazon, and Overcast. And if you have a cybersecurity story or topic that you'd like to have us explore on Security Breach, you can reach me at jeff@ien.com. For Jeff Krull, I'm Jeff Ranke, and this is Security Breach.